hide this momentous occasion. I am Bob Harrison, and I work at popculturesquad.com. I'm going to start by doing a little bit of a walkthrough of First Comics and their history, and then I'm probably not going to talk because these people are just going to go. And so that's how we're going to do this. So 40 years ago, March was the first published comic from First Comics. First Comics was founded, and the first offices were in Evanston. Eventually they came to Chicago, so it is a Chicago institution. Mike Wald, who is sitting to my right, was the founder and editorial director when it first started, and Joe Staton, who is to his right, was the art director at the time. These are the beginning. The first 4 comics that came out from First Comics were Warp, which we'll get into Mike's theory on that. E-Man, the brought back hero from the Charlton days. Mike Grell's John Sable, and also Mike Grell's Star Slayer, which was in PC Comics. The next generation of First Comics were American Flag by Howard Chaykin, which Mike is responsible for bringing Howard back into comics. Grimjack, which sprung from the pages of Star Slayer by John Ostrander and Timothy Truman, and Mars, which is truly an excellent comic, written and drawn by Mark Hempel and Mark Wheatley. As these comics, began to grow, so did First, and there was this capital idea that they had to acquire Capital Comics, which included the titles Badger and Nexus, both written by Mike Barron, also Steve Rude on Nexus, and also Whisper was part of that deal, which is a story I'm hoping we get into. And then there were a whole bunch of other things that lasted quite some time. There was Dynamo Joe, which is written by John Ostrander, Doug Rice's character. Shatter, the first digitally produced comic book, was from First Comics. The Lone Wolf and Cub was brought to America at First Comics. Tons of other things. Dread Sergeant from Jim Starlin also was printed there. And I just want to kind of introduce who's on the stage here. We have Mike Gold and Joe Staton, we've mentioned. We also have Hilary Barta, who's a cartoonist and did a lot of work early on in First Comics. We have Alex Wald, who is not the second art director of First Comics, because Doug Rice, I believe, was in between. That's what Joe's telling me. He lied to me. He lied to me. Lied. So Alex Wald is the second.
A valuable member of the team who brought a lot to production and art, but...
Yeah, talk in the microphone, Alex.
So Alex is the second art director.
Doug brought a lot to the table, a lot to the studio, but I don't think he was ever titled art director.
Okay.
I think he's around the masthead as art.
Okay, good enough. And Linda Reinhold, who was Linda Lessman at the time, and is a artist and colorist, and fantastic part of comics history. I'm going to let Mike talk a little bit here, which I know he hates to do. And can you just give for the audience and people here the thought process that you had in founding First Comics?
I lost a bet. It's just that simple. Actually, what kind of motivated me to start to start all that up was I was in Montreal, Quebec on New Year's Eve, 1973, I think. And I was hanging out at a Woolworth's, because if you're in Montreal, that's the place to be seen. And I found the graphic novels department, and they had a rack of graphic novels. They didn't call them graphic novels, nor did we, because we never had any by that point. They did. And I'm looking through all this great stuff by Drouillet and just dropped in gorgeous stuff. I didn't understand a word of it because I don't read French. But you can tell from great storytelling what was going on here. And I said, why can't we do that in the United States? So I went over to DC Comics a couple of years later, worked there for a few years, and I figured out why we couldn't do it in the United States, because the publishers are chicken shit. And I came back from New York, back to Chicago, thinking we should do something like this. I had some expertise in terms of marketing and how the business worked. So I came up with a schedule, how to actually build a company, and how to we're still doing heroic fantasy, but you know, not quite the superhero stuff that DC and Marvel were known for, and certainly not the Richie Rich stuff that Harvey was known for. So we did that, we put that together, and part of that master plan was to bring in some names that the retailers, the comic store owners knew, that also happened to be great talent. So my first move was to hire Joe. Well, let me rephrase that, to talk Joe into coming. And because Joe gave us a lot of credibility, and also, by the way, we got awful talented. And, you know, we bring in friends of mine, and, you know, people I knew well, like Mike Gorell and Howard Chaykin, who by this point had sworn off of doing anything in comics. His then wife was an agent and thought she could get work for him and other great comics artists. That didn't work out, but part of the reason why it didn't work out is because I stole Chaykin, talking him back into comics for American Flag. And we marketed it right. We had a good crew of people. Rick Oliver was at that point, my assistant editor, was doing a lot of the marketing stuff, and Bruce Patterson was our production manager, and Alex came in a little after that. We made it because we hired the best people we could find who had something interesting to say and do, which is a standard that one would think would be commonplace in any commercial operation. Comics was the exception at that point. There weren't a lot of people who didn't deserve to work in the business. There were, like any other creative form, there were better people and less gifted people. But Joe and our crew really put together a good list of titles that you had just seen. The idea was we would start with something that people wanted. Both Marvel and DC wanted to adapt the work plays, which Organic Theater, Stuart Gordon started off here in Chicago. And E-Man was always extremely popular amongst fans, not amongst the routine comics buyers, because in those days it was impossible to find Charlton comics on a regular basis. It is today as well, but that's because they're out of business. Getting Grell in to do John Sable, nobody thought of Mike Grell as a guy who would do that type of story. He was doing fantasy stories like, you know, Legion of Superheroes and Warlord. Then Starslayer, which he'd also created, was our sort of new person tryout type book. Lennon Del Sol was the first artist. He had a hard time with deadlines. We brought in Hilary, who saved our ass, and Tim Truman, who was working at TSR at the time, and John Ostrander, who was a playwright and an actor here in Chicago, the Goodman Theater, the Christmas Carol. We had mutual friends and close, a few other folks like that. So the idea is you not only have to bring in some of the best people you can find, but you have to make more. You have to help give people like Hilary and Linda, and certainly Tim and John, and Wheatley and Hempel, give them a shot. let them do the best that they could do. When Joe and Bruce went out to San Diego, they saw Wheatley's presentation from Mars. And Joe said, this is the reason why First Comics is in business, isn't it? It's to do stuff like this. Yes, it was. And it helped make Wheatley and Hempel make their careers. Both of them were in comics, but nothing overly visible. And that broke them through. So, looking back on 40 years, if I shove aside the fact that I'm ancient and I can barely move anymore, I think we did a pretty good job.
So from my perspective, and I'm going to kind of get to some of the other people here, but from my perspective, growing up at a person my age, is that First Comics changed the game. Like, First Comics is something you can't tell the story of comic books in America without. There are threads that were started and challenged and tried at First Comics that changed the way that Marvel and DC made comics. They wouldn't have done the things that they did in the later 80s if it wasn't for First Comics doing it first. I want to get Linda on board right now. Okay, why don't you tell your experience and how you came to First Comics and how that worked for you? And I think Alex kind of fits into that. So.
Okay. Just like this?
Yeah, just talk into that.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm Linda Lessman Reinhold. I use all three professionally only. And I had the best time working for First Comics. I had worked for Marvel back in the 70s, and in 1984, I moved back to Chicago area and was looking for a job. I went to a wedding down in Texas, and a good friend of the Maroon asked me casually, "And what are you doing these days?" And I said, "Well, I'm kind of between jobs." And he goes, "Oh, you have to go visit First Comics." I said, "What's that?" I'd never heard of it. And he said, "Well, they're in Evanston, you'll like them, they're doing this, that, and whatever." And he said, "You've got to call Mike Wald." So I wrote all that down, and I went back home on Sunday, and Monday morning I called First Comics. And they wanted to see me, so I made an appointment. Didn't get to talk to Mike exactly, but I did talk to my friend Mr. Wald here, who happened to mention that he'd been a fan of my coloring at Marvel. A man of great taste. In any event, he hired me on the spot, and I started working on my future husband's book, The Badger. I started out doing some lettering, and I practiced like crazy because I'd never lettered a book before. I studied lettering, and I had done a number of paste up things at Marvel and corrections and whatnot. In any event, the regular colorist, Rick Taylor, really great guy, decided he didn't want to do Badger anymore, so I got the book. Bill was a wonderful help. It was my experience at Marvel that I always wanted to talk to the creative team, you know, with the pencilers, the inkers, the people who created the work, to get a feel for what they were thinking. Because even though it's, you know, the end product is in color usually, they're working in black and white. And they may have a really good idea about mood and, you know, dreams, things that will influence what you think of the book. It will either enhance the quality or kind of ruin it. I've heard from many people who were very disappointed with books they liked that were written well or drawn well or both, and who really lost something when the coloring was not good. But in any event, it was interesting in those old days that some pencilers were incredibly interested in making the best product, you know, putting your heads together and getting an idea of what their thought was. Others were not the least interested, and I thought that was very curious. In any case, my husband-to-be, Bill Reinhold, was very interested in how the book looked, and he would call me practically every day and mention page 12, panel 4, see that thing painted blue, and it
It's
was...
possible he had an ulterior motive.
He might have had an ulterior motive, but if my husband was here right now, he'd say, well, I waited through 2 other boyfriends, and finally, after almost 2 years, we started dating. And not long afterwards, we got married and had 2 children, and they're grown up now, and our daughter is a wonderful graphic designer, and our son's a drummer. He has his own band and plays all over the Midwest, mainly Chicago. In any event, we've been married 35 years, and I would say that's a pretty good success story for a first comment.
Absolutely.
I'll just close this out by saying after I worked on The Badger a while, then I got to work on Grimjack with John Ostrander. He's an awesome guy also. Really enjoyed that. Tim Truman started, and I forget who came in after. But in addition, I worked on, what was it?
They did a lot of
Did you do
London
flower?
Star.
Did you use
I did a
flower?
lot of London Spars that I
That's
surely
for
did.
sure.
Good, no wait, American Flag.
Yeah.
Mark Badger was drawing it
Oh,
after
Badger.
Howard Chaykin left. And I liked him a lot, we got along great, and I had a lot of fun. I had 3 books a month. I was a busy gal for a long time, and until I really couldn't work anymore, busy raising children. So I worked a little at home, I worked for Marvel again, but I always had a soft spot in my heart for First.
So Alex, how did you come to First? What was your story there?
Okay.
Talking to the microphone.
Mine. I was friends with Don Bluth, and if they're really older comics readers here, you may remember Don's work for Gold Key and Dell. He did Dr. Spector, and what's the other one I'm forgetting? It's like there was 2 of them.
Turok Solar?
No, not Dr. Solar. There was something else. There was like another kind of like occult mystery hero character in addition to Dr. Spector. Anyhow, I knew Don because I was a fantasy and horror film fan, and I was collecting stuff, and I had various Japanese contacts. And Don and I had a few friends in common. Don was already living in Hollywood for many years, but I would see him when he would come to Chicago around Christmas time to be with his family. And he says, like, he knew that I was at this one occasion in between assignments. I had been doing a lot of trade magazines and there's like publishing production. And everything was done on paper for many, many years. It's, you know, a lot of you remember having computers or being mystified by them. Everything was made out of paper and glue. And that's what I specialized in. But Don said, you know, there's like a shakeup over at First Comics. Their production manager is leaving, which was Bruce Patterson. And I don't know, it's like, were you in touch with Don? It's like, that's how he knew that Bruce was leaving?
I don't recall.
Okay, somebody, someone in this room knew Don Bluth and told him that their production manager was leaving. I phoned probably the following Monday and set up an interview with Mike. I showed up in a suit and he almost like turned me away on the spot. And but we talked, and you know, like we actually had like a fairly quick rapport. Mike, I don't think he covered this already, was a disc jockey on was it WZRD or?
No, I was with a whole bunch of radio stations. All
Triad.
All no. Well, yes, I was on Triad.
You were like the midnight to dawn guy.
Yeah.
And I would stay up all night listening to Mike spin records. So, you know, I came in not knowing anybody. I had no contacts within the comics business aside from Don. And I'm going, you're my gold. And he knew that already. But, you know, like we actually had like various points of connection. And he said, well, we have a few more people to interview. We'll get back to you. And I go, yeah, right. So I left with zero expectations, but like I was kind of, you know, charged about the idea of working in a shop where they had funny pictures on the wall, and like, you know, like weird costume characters. So I found like the idea of that environment very appealing. But I think it was like a couple weeks before I got the call back to come in and get busy, you know, sweep the floors, you know, take out the trash, things like that. But no, I think the very first thing that I was put to work on was American Flag number 9, which was a late issue. So instead of being lettered on the boards, it was lettered on overlays and had to be pasted up. And I remember, like, and I'd done like every kind of paste up, but not onto original art before. I was horrified. You know, I'd like, you know, fouling the surface of the artboard. Somehow I survived, persevered, and yeah, that was my start. So like I was production manager for, I think it was like at least a year before Joe decided that he and Hilary wanted to go back home. And
their visa expired.
oh, their visa expired. Yeah, there you go. And
The other Hilary.
I'm the
other Hilary.
The one who's not an
Actual Hilary, not the other Hilary.
So I kind of defaulted into having a second job of being like a de facto art director as well as production manager.
You were the actual art director on the board, you know.
Yeah.
Now that you mention it, Alex, Tim Truman was also a fan or listener of my radio show.
No, he was in Chicago.
Lake Geneva, which is not far. I'm not sure I knew at the time that our signal got as far as Lake Geneva, but maybe they mailed it to him. But Tim was a fan of the show. That was amazing.
I'm going to Hilary, the other Hilary. I'm going to give you a second. Somebody has to go last, but I want to get to Joe here. So
No, please.
So Joe, can you take this mic? But I want to talk about how because that one's good. That was what we're recording the other one. This is the one I need you to speak into. So for those in the audience who don't know, Joe Staton is a legendary artist. He worked for DC for so many years. He was doing amazing things at DC, and somehow Mike talked him into moving, and probably had to talk Hilary a lot into moving out here. What was the impetus to do that? To come bring E-Man back over here from Charlton and to be the art director for this wild idea that Mike Gold had?
I had worked so much at DC at the time. It just seemed like I was doing Green Lantern, and that was what I wanted to do. Stay on Green Lantern, but maybe not. Maybe I just didn't feel like I was doing anything beyond what I had been doing, and the idea of maybe
much better. Do that. Talk right into it.
maybe trying something else and seeing if I actually could do something other than Green Lantern, or just doing comics, but which is a fine thing to do, but just stretch out a little bit. And I had worked with Mike at DC quite a bit. He was, I think you were the first professional PR guy for a comics company.
Yeah, first marketing guy, yeah.
Marketing guy, yeah. So Mike was doing a lot of stuff at DC that hadn't been done. So, and I had been doing stuff for him. Like, oh golly, I did the ad for the DC explosion, if you remember that. Anyway, I did that sort of thing. At DC at that time, you got work by walking down the hall and somebody would call you in. And I was walking down the hall by Mike's office at one point, and he pulled me in and kind of surreptitiously said, what else would you like to do? And I have this idea. Do you remember it going back that far? That
Roughly around that time.
Roughly around
Yeah,
that
I'm not
time.
sure that it was a DC or what. But
Yeah.
it was roughly that time.
somewhere in there. So, as things developed, I got to hear more and more about what might be happening, and passing it on to the original Hilary, who was you were still teaching, right? You were still teaching, and see if she wanted to try something else. So we kind of came around to it, and eventually showed up in Chicago, in Evanston. That's.
What's your fondest memory of first?
Oh golly, my fondest memory of first is there will be mention of someone called Rick Obadiah at some point. At some point when at first we did a lot of going around to check out accounts and stores and see what was going on. And at some point, for some reason, I was in somewhere around St. Louis, somewhere in southern Illinois, something like that, with Obadiah, and we were in a part of the country where the streams were burning, if you remember those days. But Obadiah and I have been going around checking out some of the stores and stuff. And we were sitting there in the airport, ready to head out, having a drink, and Obadiah just looks out and, oh, there's our airplane. It's just now leaving. And that's just how things were with Rick. So it kind of worked out. And there was the time, Obadiah took us all out for sushi, and it kept on coming. And we had to have deductions from our checks for months to pay out for that sushi. So there were lots of things like that. It was an interesting place to work or not. So.
Yeah. May I add something to that? You mentioned Rick, who died about 3 years ago, and I was actually driving from where I live now, which is Connecticut, to Chicago to have dinner with him and do some other stuff when he died. Rick and I didn't have a lot of contact for about, 10, 20 years, maybe at conventions. And we were able to, he had grown a lot since then. I'd like to think I had too, but at least we grew older. And we had a fabulous time when we got back together. And the year or two, it was for the 30th anniversary. For the year or two that we were able to hang out together, it was wonderful. He was a very creative guy whose reality adjusting was rather low, which allowed him to be more creative. He was the publisher at First Comics and my partner, who was on the board of directors along with me and a few other people. And his contribution to first comics in comic book history has been overlooked, I think. 30 years ago, 10 years ago rather, he reread a lot of the old first comics stuff, and he kept on calling me saying, "Hey, this is really great. This is really good." And I said, "Well, didn't you read it the first time?" He says, "Yeah, but after 20 years, this is so much better." And I took that as a real compliment. Rick was okay.
So, I don't want to make you feel any older.
It's not possible.
But Rick died 8 years ago.
Oh shit. Yeah, so really 8 years ago?
8 years ago, it was 2015. So, I'm sorry to bring that in, but Hilary, I want you to grab the mic and I want you to talk about your experiences at first. The other Hilary. So for those listening, this is Hilary Barta.
Yes, I'm the younger Hilary.
Forever to be known.
Which is every time I would go into the office to bring work in or talk to someone, like Joe saw me like, "Oh, it's the other Hilary." So, well, I believe I was probably inking at Marvel prior to starting work at first.
You were doing stuff with Joe Judd, I remember that. You worked?
No. My career started at Marvel inking, and I did that for a number of years, and I did several places, many places. But I don't remember exactly prior, so I was looking for help here. I was an inker first.
Okay, if I can screw you up, just let me know.
No, that's okay. And I don't remember doing too much penciling, certainly at the level of Marvel DC stuff before first. I'm really bad on the chronology of things here. But I was excited. I was born in Chicago, grew up in Evanston, and have lived in the city most of my life now. But I'm a Chicagoan, and there was a comic book company starting up in my hometown kind of thing. It was fun, and they were supposed to, independent comics, create our own comic. It was everything that wasn't the sort of corporate thing that I had been doing. And so I was excited about coming here. And I learned a lot of things at First Comics. Mike had this idea that somehow I could take over Star Slayer from Tim Truman preceded me,
Right.
Mike Grell, I think. And he was doing 2 books, his book, Grimjack, which I think was his first love, and then Star Slayer was more a job probably for Tim.
Yeah, I think that's true.
But in any case, he couldn't handle or didn't want to handle both, and so they needed another artist. And their whole idea was they were going to phase me in. I had no idea I could do this. I'd never done a regular book. I probably penciled a few things, but not anything major. Certainly not an ongoing series. So this was totally new, and I learned in short order that I couldn't do it all myself. Pencil and ink. John Ostrander was writing. So I ended up.
I'll interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
Over directly for Tim? Did you take over right after Tim?
I took over during Tim.
Okay, so
Yeah,
were you part of?
a couple other people in between?
Oh, there
was
were a
like-
couple people.
There was like a
Oh,
guy
Lennon
that
and
you
everybody followed.
inked, I think.
Did you have to draw the golden Moby?
But that is, unfortunately, that was my responsibility. You can blame me.
It
was my idea.
No, it was Tim's idea, and then he quit.
Anyway, well, Tim, okay, so what happened was, whoever I followed directly, Tim had been doing the book, okay? So maybe there were other artists before Tim, like Lennon and everybody who followed Mike.
Right.
Grell. But Tim was doing it, decided that he was not going to do it anymore. But they weren't just going to bring me in. For one thing, I hadn't done this before. I still don't know why you thought I could do it, but okay, you had faith. And I was going to be phased in. So I started, I think I inked him on an issue or 2 or 3 or whatever. Then I started getting rough pencils and then layouts. And eventually I was literally getting circles with a stick figure body underneath. And those were like the layout. And I would follow these layouts as best I could. And so I was learning, trial by fire. I was thrown into this. Probably was a bi-monthly, I'm guessing.
I think it was monthly.
It was monthly.
It may have gone by monthly during that
It
period.
probably went as soon as you saw how slow the work was coming in for me.
Yeah, probably.
But doing both the pencils and the inks, I was falling far behind, so I had to get an inker. And it was so weird to me that I was now going to be inked by someone when that's the one thing I had confidence in was inking. But I went and talked to as many people. You guys just said, find yourself an inker, you know, or if you don't want us to do it, you do it. And I got samples from people like Gary Gianni and a few other people that names I probably wouldn't mean anything here.
McManus too.
McManus? Sean McManus inked one?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
I think he did a sample page over you. We loved his inking, but he was looking for something more.
He should have been penciling around.
Well,
So Sean McManus is an amazing artist, yeah. Well, I don't recall that, but I might even forget the names. Mark Nelson was one of these guys. And Mark Nelson is still doing comics. He's got a book called Thunder Hunters he's working on now, and you can find him on the internet. He's great. Well, Mark came in and Mark had never really inked anybody before either. It was a learning process for us both. And after some months, it started to work, but I just wasn't cut out for that kind of schedule, I don't think. But what I learned is my favorite thing at First Comics was Munden's Bar. I think you mentioned Munden's Bar.
Yeah, that was fun.
It was a backup in Grimjack, and it was took place in Sinisher, which was one of this first comic thing where a city and all the dimensions met there, and a number of the books, Warp and other Grimjack and Star Slayer all kind of connected. Well, this took place in a bar in a place. This is basically the bar in Star Wars, the cantina in Star Wars before that ever happened.
Yeah.
You know, right? Have I already got the chronology wrong?
So let's, well, it was after Star Wars.
It was after Star Wars?
Who's read, who knows what Munden's Bar is?
Hey!
Munden's Bar needs to come back, but we'll talk.
Well, yeah.
I agree.
I love short stories, and I don't really think I have big character arcs and all that action adventure stuff yet, but the punchline ending or the short, snappy stuff, I love that stuff. And I love drawing aliens and monsters. So this was perfect for me. And these guys let me just write stories. I'd never really done that before either. So I would come in and pitch a story to you or Rick Oliver and say, sure, go ahead, draw it. And it was that simple. I really don't think anyone said, no, that's terrible. Don't do that.
Yeah, shortly after that, I think I taught you how to draw.
Right after that. Anyway, so that was, I think, the best thing I learned there was do short stories, do funny stuff, and I kind of found my voice, I think, during that time. Yeah, it wasn't the tough guys. It was making fun of the tough guys or the silly guys or whatever. And they allowed me to do that.
Yeah.
There's so much of First Comics history that is educational for the people who were there and fundamental and foundational in their careers, people who caught on from them. You mentioned Sean. Did you ever hire Sean? Sorry? I'm sorry, Alex.
I think we,
'Cause that-
I'm trying to remember what it was specifically. I've worked with him I worked with Sean just a few years ago, about 5 years ago, on a back series for Bill Willingham's Larks Killer book that we were doing
Right.
around 2016, 2017.
Somewhere in that, yeah.
But yeah, I think we worked with Sean like in the 80s once or twice, but it wasn't a steady thing.
Yeah. He had come out of DC's new talent showcase, and he dealt with DC as well.
Sean McManus?
Yeah.
He did at least one issue of Grimjack, and I inked that issue. So
Yes.
yeah, I remember that.
So all of those books I was mentioning earlier, these are all going to be 40 years old this year. Those four. But I want to talk just a minute about Grimjack, and this is going to be, I guess, Mike's situation here. But for those who don't know, Grimjack was a backup in Star Slayer that John Ostrander's brainchild, and he brought Timothy Truman in to design it. The concept, this is where something like First Comics, where something was able to grow organically. I'm going to relay the story that John told to me. You can correct me, but John had done some writing on Star Slayer, and the concept of Sinisher existed there, and he thought it was absolutely stupid to throw it away in a one-issue story. So he evolved the character of Grimjack as living there, which gave him the access to all different realities, and that's how Grimjack, evolved from Star Slayer, became the first like kind of germinated book.
Actually, Bob, if I can interject, I have a variant memory on that.
Okay, well, that's John's memory.
Sinister did blossom in Star Slayer, but if I'm not mistaken, it was a throwaway by Peter Gillis.
Yes.
Work.
Absolutely right.
Okay, it was
And that's the origin of Sinister, but it wasn't developed. It was literally like, it's like, oh, and we have a pan-dimensional city.
Right.
And then you're not gonna do anything with that? Come on.
Right.
Just one side that is everybody knows the concept of the multiverse now. We turned on the TV, there it is. First had it first. Now, first had it before, but it was around, and now everybody knows it.
That's right. And also we coined the phrase grim and gritty. As well. Should have trademarked that.
Yes.
But,
Did you trademark the word bars? Did they trademark that? Is that?
yes, we filed for let me tell you a story about First Comics that didn't get around much. And it probably should. It's the story about the day I almost killed Joe Staton.
Oh, I want to hear this.
Joe had this big art director's chair. I think it was taller than he.
Yes.
And he had this wonderful like art director's art board in front of him, and
Which was very large.
it was huge, and it was just a wonderful thing to look at. Joe on the chair at the board working. Joe also had, and probably still has, this tendency to sneeze a billion times in a row. So at one point I asked Joe, at what point should I be worried? And Joe said, about 10 times. I said, okay. Now one day, my office was just, pretty much next to Joe's, and I hear him start to sneeze. And by habit, I start to count. And somewhere around 7 or 8, I go, shit, I lost count. And Joe starts to laugh. He doesn't stop sneezing. He's now sneezing and laughing and not breathing. And the first thought that comes to my mind is he's gonna pass out and fall off of that chair, which is horrible. So I just ran over there, and by that point Joe had stopped sneezing and he was okay. But that little cry of mine, shit, I lost count, almost killed him. And I have to let you know, I do not carry guilt around with me because it's way too much baggage. But I still feel guilty about that.
So there's one other story that we're gonna give you guys a chance to ask some questions, but there's another story I wanted to tell. And Alex, did you go on the trip up to Madison?
No.
The trip.
The trip.
No, I made subsequent trips to Madison.
I would like for Mike.
Not the very first
If
one.
everyone is
No,
okay.
that's Mike's story.
If anybody's okay with that, I would like for Mike to tell the trip to Madison.
With beer?
Yes. So these books both existed, and they were owned by Capital Comics. You go from there.
Capital Comics went out of business. They were one of the major distributors at the time, comic book distributors. And they decided to do some publishing, and they did Nexus, first as a black and white magazine. Then after Furniture became a color comic, and they did Badger at the same time, both written by Mike Barron. I forget how many issues of Badger were published.
There were four.
Four issues, okay. By the time we took over, but they decided to pull the plug. Steve Grant created Whisper for them. very good series, and people tend to overlook it, and that annoys me.
So just so you know, Sandy Gerald is probably the biggest Whisper fan I've ever met. He loves Whisper. Go ahead.
We got it back in print as a fundraiser for Norm Rizzo. So we go up to, I guess Obadiah and I go up to Madison to talk with the guys who own Capital City Distribution. And we're in their art director's office, which was a standalone office. It was not part of their operation. But it overlooked the Capitol building, state Capitol building in Wisconsin. And Barron is there at the end of the table, and Milton Gripe, who is one of the two owners, is there, and I'm essentially negotiating with him. And Rich Burning was next to me. And we make the deal, pretty much we make the deal for Nexus and Badger, and I wanted Whisper as well. I wanted Whisper because it was a good book. I also wanted to Whisper because I didn't want somebody else to get a hold of it, because it would bring more magic and energy to First Comics if we acquired essentially what had been Capital Comics. That was a minor thing, but I said it. People think of it, retailers thought of it as those three books were related. Milton did not want to sell us Whisper at all. We can argue whether he had the right to sell it to us or not, but that involves Steve Grant, and I really don't know. And finally, I'm making this point where I refuse to do the deal without it. So no, we want the whole thing. And Milton is just as adamant. He turns to Rich Burning and he says, "Rich, this guy's full of shit, isn't he?" And Rich says, "Well, no, Milt, actually, I understand what he's saying. I think he's right." And Milt just loses it. He goes, "Well, then let's forget it." Barron, who is not of this world, turns around, screams words that I would repeat under certain circumstances, and opens up the window that overlooks the Capitol building, which is a very busy place to be. And he jumps out the window, he lowers himself out the window, and he's holding onto the windowsill by his hands. And he says, "I'm just gonna hang here until I drop or you guys cut a deal." This scared Obadiah of something fierce. I knew Mike from the conventions and stuff, and I was kind of used to it actually. And so was Milt, obviously, because without even looking backwards at Mike hanging out of the window across the state capitol building, Milt just dismisses it and he says, "Well, if you feel that strongly about it, then okay." And that's how that deal closed. And I love it. It's not a negotiation technique that I've used or been involved with since. But then again, how often are you having meetings in Madison, Wisconsin like that? So the opportunity just didn't come up as far as I'm concerned.
That's a story that people need to know.
Yeah, I think so. It was just a wacky story full of wacky people. And to tell you the honest truth, if you talk to most people, certainly those of us who are now on Social Security, the reason why we got into comics and the reason why we stayed in comics is because it's not from this world. It's weird. It's wacky. You meet people like the people I just discussed all the time, and they're wonderful human beings. And there's no mistake about it. There's a direct connection between their preposterous worldview and their creative abilities. So the weirder you are, as long as you can make deadlines and write or draw beautifully, I'm there. I don't care how weird you are. And that got me into some trouble at First Comics and some trouble at DC Comics. Ultimately, I went back there for 7 years as their director of development and group editor. And
And you know, it brought us The Question and Suicide Squad and a whole bunch of other things that changed the game as well. So
actually, The Question was set right where Rick Obadiah and Joe Staton had that drink. It was really set in East St. Louis. Hub City was East St. Louis, right across the river. And Hub City was an atrocious city. It was really the star of The Question. But the fact of the matter is, there were stories, real stories about East St. Louis back in those days. They don't like those stories because it tinges them, their reputation. But it's true, there were stories that were so outrageous we could not adapt them to comic books. And when you just mentioned the story, I was thinking, yeah, Hub City.
we have about 5 minutes. Does anybody have any questions for these folks? Go ahead.
I'm curious how first got into publishing manga so early. How did you get the rights to Lone Wolf and Cub and the Bazinga Z-Graphic novel?
Rick Obadiah had been
After your time.
Rick Obadiah had been to American Booksellers Association convention, something that has transformed itself quite a bit. It's now like American Library Association. ABA, there were a couple vendors who were promoting what we now know as manga. They had prepared special English editions of Lone Wolf and Cub and Devilman, those two, from, God, was it Kodansha? It was either Kodansha or one of the other bigger manga publishers. And he came back from the convention with these promo editions. And I was already long familiar with manga. I'm not sure anybody else was. And I said, do it. And like Rick Oliver said, there's naked women in here, we can't do it. And so we split the difference. They decided to go with Lone Wolf and Cub and not go with Devilman, which itself was having its 40th anniversary a couple of years ago. That was a game changer too. So there were other books like kind of hot on our heels, like there was an edition of Kamui, I think it was, like Kamui the Ninja Boy came from, was it Eclipse or Pacific? Eclipse
I
probably.
think it was Eclipse.
Yeah, but I think we were the first out of the gate with like an English version of a manga. But that was Rick Obadiah, he brought it back, and I said, do it, and everybody goes, well, I don't know. And he says, like, who are we gonna get for covers? And I don't know who suggested Frank Miller, maybe me. And so like, well, you know, like, here's this other guy, he's into manga too. His name's Frank Miller, and go, that was it, the deal was done.
Yeah, the funny part about that is, I wasn't involved in Lone Wolf. I was gone from the company by that point. But I would go to, when I was living in Chicago, I would go out to New York and visit Chaikin, who shared a studio with Frank Miller and Walter Simonson, and rotating fourth chair. And Frank and I were both fans of Japanese movies. We were big Zatoichi fans back before anybody knew who Zatoichi is, and I suspect there are a lot of people who don't know who he is now, but we loved him. And we would sit there in the studio and talk about that stuff, and we would talk about Lone Wolf and Cub. So my familiarity with the character, with the concept, came from Frank before first got it. Which, and when I heard that deal happened, I thought this was perfect. And it turned out to be perfect for first and also later, I guess, Dark Horse. Then they reprinted.
Yeah, they reprinted all the issues that we did and then continued, because we only got, I think, well, we combined, some issues had one story or part one of a story, and other issues had like two stories in them, because the original manga were not all to like a uniform length. But yeah, Dark Horse continued Like
Yeah.
they got through all, it's like nearly 1,000 pages for the whole series.
Yes.
At this point, I just want to mention Doug Rice.
Yes.
Because when you mention Japanese manga, Japanese comics, Doug did Dynamo Joe at First Comics, the first giant robot, you know, influenced by Japanese animation and comics. And I think he might have even worked on production on Lone Wolf and Cub. Maybe he was
He
still
did,
doing
yeah, it was like, well,
because he was on staff.
he was on staff,
He
but
was in the
he
production
was
department.
doing like Dynamo Joe on staff.
Yeah, yeah.
And Paul Guinan was working on Lone Wolf and Cub
Okay.
for the most part.
Okay. Okay. But so those two
Yeah, there's
books,
a
those
lot
two
of
books are,
crossover,
yeah.
yeah.
I don't know who. I mean, I know in short order there were Ben Dunn was doing giant
Yeah,
robot
like,
stuff.
yeah, the Texas guy.
But that was a pretty new book.
Yeah.
In the States.
Doug, who I cannot praise enough, this weird worldview, but a wonderful guy. Doug was holding monthly anime showings at George Brio's old comic book store on the northwest side of the city. And he would have somebody there to translate it, because they're all in Japanese, and we got exposed to anime long before it became a thing. And that helped, I think, set the tone for all of what you're talking about, definitely Dynamo Joe.
I mean, I used to go to Doug's apartment. That's where I went.
Yeah.
I didn't go to George Brio's place, I don't think. But Doug would just show his videotapes then of whatever. This was the first time I saw Miyazaki and his films. And early stuff, you know, Porco Rosso and all that stuff. But Doug would translate, because Doug had just learned rudimentary Japanese, I think, because he loved the film so much.
Doug and his love for anime is the direct result of the Vietnam War. Because Doug was in the Vietnam War, and he would have leave and go to Tokyo, where he discovered all of this great stuff that he would bring back long before anybody knew the word manga or anything. So our popular culture owes a debt to Doug.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I apologize.
One more question, come on.
Got one more question. We gotta get out of here, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I've been reading first books since back in the 80s, and I would say I recently reread all of Grimjack and noted how many Chicago references are in that book. I was at a recent Chicago Comics exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art, and I was disappointed to see there was no presence from First, which to me is a big part of Chicago's comics history. And I guess I wonder at this point what it was about Chicago and your company and your friendship, all of that, that drove you to create the work that you did.
Yeah, there was like Hal Foster and Chet Gould and First Comics. How's that?
It's a pretty good trio.
Yeah, really. John Ostrander is a fellow native Chicagoan. He went to Loyola, he was in Loyola's theater department. He and I back then, and to this day, because I've known John since 1971, to this very day, we talk about Chicago and Chicago history and Chicago stuff all the time, which makes us a lot like most other Chicagoans of our generation, I should point out. But even to this day, he lives in central Michigan now, and we still do this. I still send him stories about great Chicago characters. So, you know, John, as a writer, you work with what you know or what you see, and if you know something that other people aren't really hip to, then you've got a story. And John did that. He did that at DC to a lesser extent, although we did work Charlie Myers into a Hawkman story, into a Hawkworld story, along with a Bucket of Suds, which was a real bar that was the real location of the real Munden's bar.
Well, specifically Bob, the watch lizard, if you know Munden's bar. Bob was the the watch lizard, this alcoholic lizard that would bum cigarettes off of all the patrons of the
Yeah,
bar.
yeah.
And at night, Gordon Munden, who ran the bar, who was a real person and a friend of John's, right?
Yeah.
He would throw him in a vat of whiskey or something, a barrel, and he would just lay in there all night.
Piss something or other.
So, but Bob is based, where it was inspired. John is sitting in the Bucket of Suds, which is a great old Chicago joint.
Oh, it's wonderful.
And there were all these very curious old bottles of liquor, and one was a Chinese liqueur that had a lizard inside the bottle, the same way you have a worm in a bottle of mezcal. This had a lizard. And John, I was in the bar with John, and he's like, "That's Bob."
And that's true, and that's also where John, I think, certainly fell in love with Kim Yale.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I missed the Bucket for so many reasons. Joe Dano was the guy who owned it. He created all of his own bizarre concoctions.
Toxic milkshakes, these alcoholic milkshakes.
Yes, yes.
The chick dug them.
He's a Chicago legend, and not the ones that they put on TV on Sunday evenings, Sunday nights. But a great guy. He had a voice that sounded like he'd been gargling razor blades all his life, yet was see, it's a radio guy who gave me that laugh. And he did a jazz show. He did he was a jazz disc jockey. He made all of his own drinks and all of his own concoctions, and was a great storyteller. And he had that page from Hawk World that John wrote. Greg Milman, I think, was the artist. He had the original art for that page up on the wall of the Bucket. So I miss that place.
Well, unfortunately, on that note, we need to end this. They're going to kick us out. The show's over. But thanks so much. We have a big round of applause.